Greetings, I'm Dack Rouleau.
I'm Christy Rouleau.
And this is the Overwritten Book Club. We are back after a bit of a hiatus. Thank you for bearing with us, but we are going to continue to read Machiavelli's The Prince. This week we are going to review chapters 15 through 20, I believe.
Yes.
And in this section of the book, Machiavelli talks about the prince or the sovereign, the leader of a nation. Machiavelli talks about how that leader must maintain a relationship towards his subjects. And there's a lot of psychological content in this book talking about what the prince should be, how he should appear before his subjects. So Christy, just what were some of your immediate reactions to this particular section?
This section of the book, I feel like it's down to the nitty-gritty of the personality traits the prince really should have. Many of these chapters, he's presenting two ideals and debating whether one is better than the other, but ultimately concludes the prince needs both.
Yep.
And if he doesn't have both, he needs to be aware of both and sort of a fake it till you make it type of a thing. And I feel like we kind of built this laundry list of all of these characteristics the prince should have in order to be an effective ruler.
Yeah, specifically, he's talking about how the prince whether the prince should be feared or respected by his subjects. Mm-hmm. And the conclusion he should come to is that the prince should strive to maintain both. The prince should be both feared and admired. But if necessary, the prince should be, if it's necessary to choose one or the other, the prince should choose to be feared rather than admired.
Right.
And this was interesting because in this independent media, however you want to call it, you see a lot of calls for political honesty. Commentators and reactionaries want a leader who is completely forthcoming and honest with the people and who is loved rather than feared. But that need to keep people in line is something that is often missing in this independent media analysis.
Right. There is never a conversation that the leader that the progressive independent media really wants should have any fearful attributes, that there should be nothing to fear. They want somebody who's very personable and relatable, but Machiavelli does not agree with that as being an effective leader.
Well, it's interesting how these people in the so-called political underground obviously feel that the leader should be feared, even if they don't say it explicitly. You saw how criticizing Tulsi Gabbard on the campaign trail was blasphemy. You must live in fear and respect of her awesome power. Bernie Sanders supporters had the same view. If you're criticizing him, you're just playing into the establishment's hands. With Donald Trump, there was quite a bit of that. Whatever Donald Trump says must go. And so, yeah, there is definitely the people do want a leader who is formidable and venerable in that sense, even if they don't want to formulate the criterion explicitly.
Right. I think there is also an aspect of being, Machiavelli talks about being generous or being too overly generous. And then you are ultimately considered, the word he uses is a miser.
Yes.
But the conclusion he makes is that you just have to basically grow thick skin and be used to being hated by being so overly generous, but not too much. And so there's a fine line, I think, that he's really creating of where that perfection is. And I don't know, now that we've got to this part of the book, if anybody can actually achieve this.
Well, maybe that's why it's so difficult to find a respectable and effective political leader. I mean, we if you were to ask who is your favorite political leader of history, people stutter because they know that every leader can be criticized for this reason or that.
Right.
Usually in these circles, people focus too much, I think, on the leader's moral failings. But as far as leadership qualities, that's something that we don't like to talk about. We just like to focus on the issues that the leader is supposed to be advocating for. Not in his case, because in Machiavelli's time, there wouldn't have been such an emphasis on democracy and the leader adhering to that democratic ideal.
Right.
So with that being said, let's get to our first quotation. We have, it looks like 4 or 5 quotes we're going to look at here. Okay, so here's the first quote talking about how a person lives versus how a person appears to live. Image versus lifestyle. And here we go. Quote, "The gulf between how one should live and how one does live is so wide that a man who neglects what is actually done for what should be done moves towards self-destruction rather than self-preservation. The fact is that a man who wants to act virtuously in every way necessarily comes to grief among so many who are not virtuous. Therefore, if a prince wants to maintain his rule, he must be prepared not to be virtuous and to make use of this or not according to need." End quote. So what were your reactions to that? You're talking about how the need for a lack of virtue in certain critical situations.
I think that starts to play into the more fearful side of not necessarily always being this virtuous leader who does something that appeases the public and the public likes. I think this quote speaks to how to build that fear in the public.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were watching Fight Club last night, and in that film, obviously, the Tyler Durden character employs unvirtuous means in order to accomplish his ends. He advocates for certain forms of violence, not just wanton, reckless violence, but in certain situations, bombings and things like that, to overcome the corrupt establishment. And this is something I've been thinking about quite a bit, is what is the extent to which revolutionary action is acceptable? And the view I have is that in a sense, I would like a revolutionary to overthrow the establishment. But then once that establishment is overthrown, I would like a person who does not advocate for those means to govern the society after the fact. The comparison, if I can just make it quickly, is you have Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Malcolm X argued that MLK was he was moving too slowly, I suppose, in trying to create a better society. In a sense, I would like someone with Malcolm X's vigor and passion to overthrow the establishment, but then once the establishment is overthrown, I would prefer to see someone like MLK governing that society and setting that example, if that makes.
So in that sense, the prince almost can't be he can't be a single person. He has to be two different individuals to have both sides. These personalities.
I suppose so. If the revolutionary, or if the prince is going to be a revolutionary, which he does talk about overthrowing governments in certain instances, I guess kind of like maybe the best comparison in that sense would be Fidel Castro. Someone who was able to overthrow the colonialist authority, but then was able to govern his society after the fact. I don't know, just a random comparison there, but it seems to be fitting.
Yeah.
With that being said, should we go to the second quote? Okay. Now, this is an interesting piece where Machiavelli is talking about whether the subjects should be armed, whether the people the prince governs should have arms. And this obviously pertains to a lot that's going on now, but let's just read the quote. Quote, "No new prince has ever at any time disarmed his subjects. Rather, when he has found them unarmed, he has always given them arms. This is because by arming your subjects, you arm yourself. Those who were suspect become loyal, and those who were loyal not only remain so, but are changed from being merely your subjects to being your partisans." End quote. So, what would you?
I thought that was very interesting in context of the United States gun control debate, that it just is never ending. And as you read that, I just had the thought that perhaps because the United States does not want ultimately it seems it does not want its citizens to remain armed, at least the left doesn't. Maybe that's because we don't have anybody directly. We don't have another country right next to us that's threatening to invade.
Right.
We've become such a superpower in the world that having our citizens armed has no use for the government. We cannot be, they cannot gain loyalty from that aspect.
Well, yes, with the gun control debate, and we don't want to reduce everything Machiavelli said to what's happening now, but I think that's a good way to introduce ourselves to the book, is trying to figure out what sense can we personally make of it? Otherwise, it just becomes a specimen for historical analysis.
Right.
But yeah, I think that the idea of arming your citizens in order to get them to respect you, you could argue that that's a manipulation tactic used by the Republican Party. They claim to be they claim to be the ones advocating for Second Amendment rights and the right to bear arms in order to try to position themselves as trustworthy leaders. But then we see that once they get into power, they're extremely corrupt. They're trying to dismantle the social infrastructure and everything else. We could obviously talk about how the Democrats do not follow Machiavelli's wisdom by trying to disarm people, but there's also something to be said about how people who want to arm the subjects manipulate the masses.
Right, and he goes on to say about how if you start to disarm your subjects, you offend them, you are showing either through cowardice or suspicion that you mistrust them, and eventually hatred starts to be coming up around you. And I think that's interesting to the countries that have disarmed their citizens, like we're thinking like New Zealand, Australia type of the situation, and what they're going through right now. But really, there is no good reason, according to Machiavelli, that you would want to disarm your citizens. Like, that just is he doesn't even entertain any other like logical reason you would do that.
You know, what's interesting too is that he's talking about how disarming your citizens, or your subjects rather, is a bad idea. He was living at a time when a mass uprising would be a lot more practical or realistic than it is today.
Yeah.
One of the arguments that's made for repealing the Second Amendment is that the citizens of the United States, obviously, despite their massive amount of firearms, do not actually have the ability to overthrow the government, because the government has superior military firepower and hardware and technology.
Right.
But Machiavelli was writing at a time when theoretically the peasants could overthrow the state, because they were more or less even with their weaponry.
Right.
And yet he was not afraid of that.
Right. Yeah. In that sense, it seems illogical that the United States would even consider taking away weapons of just a very small nature compared to what they have, the caliber of what they have.
Yeah.
Why are they feeling threatened? And why are they making? But they make the argument that we are not safe with each other with guns.
Right.
And so, in essence, our government, is using weapons to turn us against each other.
You know, Machiavelli talks about how the subjects need arms in order to feel safe against their government. Our government tells us that we need to give our guns up so that we are safe from each other.
Yep.
They're trying to sow dissension. And that brings us to the next quote. You kind of quoted the third, what we were going to talk about here, so maybe we should just proceed to this one. Machiavelli's talking about dissension, trying to deliberately divide the masses in order to facilitate the ruler's agenda. Let's take a look at that. Quote, "I do not believe that any good at all ever comes of dissension. On the contrary, on the approach of the enemy, cities which are so divided inevitably succumb at once. The weaker faction will always go over to the invader, and the others will not be able to hold out." End quote. So if you want to...
Yeah, and I think we are experiencing this a lot. We were talking earlier today about how the government has created division through allowing the media, bringing in the media to help them with it, but also allowing corporations and lobbyists to control the government. And I was saying how I don't think everybody wants to realize how the division that is being created and the way the government is pushing this machine of division through, we're not going to be able to remain 50 United States.
Right.
Because the division is getting so deep, and eventually one faction is going to go over to the government and the other one is going to hopefully go out on its own, but like this says that, you know, they may not be able to hold out.
Well, yeah, that's something we've occasionally talked about secession. I remember talking to D. Pierce SSC in a video about that once. Personally, in theory, I'm all for it. I think that this country has a difficult time holding itself together. But at the same time, I think the reason why we don't have unity in this country is it's largely artificial. I think that the state has been trying to divide the masses with the help of the media, obviously. But yes, the government obviously wants us fighting with each other. The government wants, just like we talked about the guns, the government wants us to be suspicious of one another and fighting with one another and distrustful and hateful towards each other. And yes, you can certainly make an argument that facilitates the agenda of the people in power. But Machiavelli argues that it actually makes you extremely vulnerable to all sorts of efforts at external destabilization.
Right. And what's going on now is a little bit different than like what we experienced during the Civil War. It's not a North versus South thing.
No.
You could say it's more of a two-party, you know.
It's an ideological thing.
Yeah, it's not a logistical clear cut. We're cutting the country in half. We're cutting it this way.
Yeah.
So that's where secession is a little questionable, because it's how do you divide a country up that way?
Yeah.
How do you divide a country when you've got states over here and they're not all collectively together to be their own entity?
Right, because Iowa presumably would not be in the same camp as like Minnesota because of the political differences.
Right.
You could argue that New Hampshire would not be in the same ideological camp as Massachusetts, even though they're right next to each other.
Right.
Even like, yeah, just cutting it across the Mason-Dixie line is not going to get the job done.
No.
But I think more what he's talking about here with this idea of dissension, our government doesn't seem to be concerned about that, because the government is not concerned with unity or that sense of patriotism. The government is concerned with maintaining its own power. Yeah. And so this short-sighted goal, I mean, this is something we've talked about in previous video episodes of the Overwritten Book Club, is how our modern leaders do not seem to understand Machiavellian wisdom freedom at all.
No.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I just think this quote really points to the fact that there is a plan. There is a reason for the dissension. And a lot of times I think people want to say, well, this is just a byproduct of our society. It's not the government pushing this. They don't have an agenda they're trying
ridiculous.
to create. But I think that this really shows, that yes, there is an agenda behind creating this division. What is it? We're still, I think, unraveling that.
Yeah, you can make an argument as a fascist for dissension, clearly, but Machiavelli acknowledges that. But he also says that he doesn't think it's a good idea. He thinks it's short-sighted. And he says that he talks about the city being invaded by a foreign power, and if you have division, half of the population will presumably go to the side of the invader. Now, that might not be realistic in America in the year 2021, but you can see that America, the plan for deliberate division does depend on America's military supremacy. If there were to be a time where America was eclipsed in its military capabilities, then a foreign country could definitely exploit this division in order to try to take over. I mean, wasn't this the Democrats' fear with Russia, or the Republicans' fear with China, is that one of these countries is going to exploit our division that they are themselves causing?
Right, and I think the bigger problem, I do think that they each have their own bad guy they want to point to, but I think the bigger problem and what we are facing is our own government invading us.
Right.
But not the government that was created initially with the formation of the United States, this new sort of fascist government that wants to have total control over us.
Yeah.
That's our invader.
With the authoritarianism of the pandemic, I think we are getting a taste of what it's like to live under America's imperialist regime.
Yeah.
The idea of like a foreign country being invaded by the U.S. Obviously, this is not as bad as it would be if you were living in a place like Libya.
Right.
But I think we're getting a sense of it to a limited extent. We're getting a sense of, okay, the government has this total control. It's unwilling to listen to your complaints. Supplies are becoming scarcer. Economically, this is not working. People are being pressured and squeezed and disrespected. We do get a sense of what it's like to be subjugated by an imperialist power.
Yeah, you had mentioned that a few weeks ago, that we are experiencing what so many other countries have when our imperialism comes in and takes over, shakes everything up, and then left in worse condition than they were before. Now I think the question is, what's going to remain? How is this country going to look after this is over with?
Yeah, when the pandemic started, people had said that the panic buying that resulted in depleted shelves at the grocery store, that was what it might be like to live in Venezuela, where the United States is hammering the country economically. But the bigger question about authoritarianism and living under the colonialist rule is something that people didn't really talk about as much. But yeah, we are getting a sense of what it feels like to be colonized and invaded, except the American government is invading its own citizenry at this point.
Right.
So on that note, there's one last quote we're going to look at here where Machiavelli talks about a situation where the prince gains control of a foreign nation by exploiting internal dissension and division. So let's read that quote here. Quote, "I shall remind princes who have recently seized a state for themselves through support given from within that they should carefully reflect on the motives of those who helped them. If these were not based on a natural affection for the new prince, but rather on discontent with the existing government, he will retain their friendship only with considerable difficulty and exertion, because it will be impossible for him in his turn to satisfy them." End quote. So what were some of your thoughts?
That sort of reminds me of the conversation we were having about Tulsi Gabbard sort of being this, she probably wanted to be more of a mainstream politician, but instead her ideas and the things she stood up for kind of grasped on to more libertarian viewpoints.
Yeah.
And had she become president, ultimately Democrats were not going to allow her to keep those.
Right. And actually, I was thinking more along the lines of Joe Biden, where, in a sense, Biden was able to campaign in a completely negative sense, saying just, I'm not Donald Trump, please vote for me. So he obtained power through people disliking Donald Trump. I know some people say he didn't win the election, but even so, that would mean that he relied on the help of people who disliked Donald Trump, regardless of whether the election was legitimate. We don't need to have that discussion right now. But yes, now that he is in power, you can see how inept he is and how dysfunctional his administration is. And literally the only thing they have to fall back upon is the fear of Trumpism rising again. Like the Democrats were quick to paint their failure in Virginia recently in the gubernatorial race as the resurgence of Trump, having nothing to do with the Democrats' dysfunction or shortcomings.
Right, and also discounts any other conservative viewpoint or any wrongdoing that the left is also conducting right now that what we saw in Virginia was a backlash against. You know, we want to point to our bad guy Trump and this fueled new Republican and thinking everything can be pointed back to this one enemy, and that's not the case.
Yeah, that teleological perspective will not get them very far. And you can see that now, where there was this, they said that there was a 15-point swing among white women in Virginia voting for the Republican rather than the Democrat. I think that it shows that the Democrats did not actually convince large new demographics to become loyal to the Democratic Party. They just exploited their hatred of Trump to get what they wanted one time.
And I think the Democrats are going a bit too far. They're carrying things too far. And what I saw in Virginia was a lot of talk about parental rights, especially right now during the pandemic, and there's a lot of discussion on whether parents should or should not be involved in schools, or whether it's curriculum or mask mandates or vaccines, whatever. And I think the left is treading into a very dangerous area, and you're just not going to you're not going to hold on to this progressive ideal. I said this before, parents who are less involved in their children's upbringing, education, they just send them to school, assume everything is well, you're going to start waking up those NPCs to, oh, wait a minute, now my government doesn't want me involved? Well, now I really want to know what's going on. So I think they've bit off more than they can chew, and we saw this with Virginia, that white women especially are like, no, well, I'll vote for the other guy. I don't like where this is going.
In a sense, kicking the parents out of the classroom is kind of like disarming the subjects.
Yes.
Actually,
it is.
You're telling them you cannot have this power. You must be kept out of it, and we can't even tell you why. It's for your own good.
Right. You don't need to know what's happening behind the curtain.
Right. And there was one other point I wanted to make about how they cannot rely on that model to accomplish everything they want.
No.
I mean, just saying that we have to disarm you, we have to kick you out of the classroom, we have to deny you your freedoms just to protect you from Trumpism. That is an incredibly myopic strategy. I mean, they seemed to solicit a lot of ballots in 2020. They were able to convince the people, especially in urban areas, who did not even know what they were doing, just to check off the box for the guy who's not Trump while leaving the rest of the ballot blank. But is that really going to be a winning strategy in 2024? I mean, how Trump is not going to live forever.
No.
Are they going to be able to just sustain this fear of the boogeyman in every election moving forward?
No, and I think they are not realizing that. At least they didn't in this election. Because I think the enemy that they made out of Trump and what he did, I think more people are waking up to, well, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't,
the Republic did not collapse.
Yeah, it's not as fearful as they want to make it. And I don't think 22 is going to go very well for them if they continue this path, and 2024 is not either.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose if Trump was running in 2024, and we don't want to reduce everything Machiavelli said to that, but I think it is relevant to talk about the modern context of this book, is that, you can see how the propaganda methods that Machiavelli talked about really are not being followed by our modern political leaders. And maybe they have their own philosophy, but it just seems to me that it's not working very well. They're trying to they're employing these propaganda methods that might work with a completely illiterate and uninformed citizenry.
Right.
But if you have means of self-education and enlightenment, then obviously these strategies are even more outdated than Machiavelli's when he was dealing with a completely illiterate peasantry.
Yeah. And as we go forward, I think we're going to see whether the left holds on to this propaganda and continues as we are coming out of COVID land. I think more and more people are disgruntled with what is happening.
Right, they're becoming disillusioned. And we hope to continue disillusioning them and radicalizing them. It's what we do, especially since we don't have to worry about the dislike button anymore on this channel. We don't have to worry about some of our enemies in the independent media downvoting our stuff just because they don't like us for... Not sure why they don't like us, actually.
Because we call out their bullshit.
Pretty much. So with that being said, we would both like to thank our audience for tuning into this episode of the Overwritten Book Club. Please consider subscribing to this channel and helping to increase Overwritten's visibility. So we'll be back next week with the fifth and final episode of our analysis of Machiavelli's The Prince. We will be reading the book to the end. Hope that you will join us. We had other videos earlier this week, including an examination of whether Anthony Fauci works for the Democratic Party. Spoiler alert, he does. And we also posted a video in which we examined Aaron Rodgers being sacrificed to the coronavirus cult. And actually, this video will be coming out on Thursday, November the 11th, and later that evening, I will be joining Reed Coverdale on his show, The Naturalist Capitalist, to discuss a number of things, including, I hope, the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. So I hope that you will join us for those discussions and others. Thank you very much, and good night.
Good night.